Thank you all very much. Thank you, Paolo. I think I would like to start from, let's say, general or basic question to all three of you listening to your very interesting talks. All of them had somehow the elements, references to the fundamentals of games and play that we kind of were discussing always in game studies. But talking always about improvement in life and about the constant datification and quantification of everything, I would like basically to ask if there is still a reason to kind of differentiate games and play, to talk about how it's not a game if we can't quit, or to refer to Galois, when it looks more and more that game, that especially play, is being subsumed, enclosed, disappears. Do you still see a reason for us to go back to the fundamentals, let's say, of game studies, or we should rather turn to different approaches and methodologies that we also discussed in your approaches? Because, for instance, Jennifer brought in Goffman, you brought in more Foucault, and Paolo referred to Gary Hall. I just wanted to somehow put this together and see how we could discuss that.
I guess I'll start.
Please.
I think that if we want to go in that direction, there still is a lot of game studies, perhaps not the traditional game studies, that talks about these issues, and that would be, you know, sort of the proceduralism debate that's happening right now about, are games designed experiences by designers where we expect players to take away a certain message, go through certain steps, or are games only existing because they're played and in the social interaction there? So I think that game studies still has a lot to offer, even in the discussion about whether play is being subsumed or not.
Yeah. If I can elaborate on that, I would answer your question. Yes, it is very important to differentiate, because play is a much broader term than games. Games are something you play, but not all forms of play are games. And, you know, if you think of your traditional games, traditional board game, you know, or even, you know, a single player computer game, that's a closed rule system where you go through repetitive interactions with the rule systems, and that's fairly simple. And there are much higher levels of plays, like play as a form of creation, play as, you know, the creation of games or the creation of models is a form of play. The changing of the rules, the subverting the rules is a form of play. And this is all something that goes beyond the term of game. So that's why I think it's very important to differentiate between both terms. And with regards to your question of if play is being completely enclosed, that was your formulation, in these new gamified applications, I don't know if the term enclosed is the correct one, because that's actually what we had over the last 200 years. You know, in bourgeois culture, what Foucault calls spaces of enclosure, whether it's the factory, the school, or the prison. You know, game and play was conceptualized as a space of enclosure as well. You know, when you think about Johan Huizinga or Roger Galois, they talk about play having these definite borders of space and time, and they tried to fence it in. And actually what we're experiencing now with all these different kinds of pervasive play, pervasive games that are expanding the time we play, the spaces we play in, augmented reality games, alternative reality games, we're seeing that this enclosure model doesn't work anymore. What I think is a more apt description is that play is becoming codified in many places, and that's the shift that goes parallel with the shift from disciplinary society to control society. And whether this codification can capture all of play, that's something I think we should look at critically, and it's a field of research. My personal position is that I don't think that's possible, but we see attempts being made.
Yeah, I think in a sense, to answer this question, we need to find a way to reimagine this relation between games and gamers. We tend to kind of solidify this distinction between games as somehow forms of systems with rules, and then on the other end there are like gamers and players who somehow engage with these systems as separated objects. And the answer is probably in the work of Kelois that Mark has been bringing in. So Kelois is very often mentioned for his latest book, Men, Play and Games, which is in fact the most terribly conservative and boring text he ever wrote. Not your fault, it's Kelois' fault. But most of his work, well, it is conservative because it is essentially an attempt to understand what games are, what are their structures, etc. But most of his work, his early work, has actually been around trying to complicate the boundaries between ourselves and the games that we play. And that's, in fact, where then he brings the notion of life. He immediately needs to understand and to find new forms of life. And I think somehow the answer could be in his work, or in a sense, I think we need to find different narratives of the relation between gamers and games.
Yeah, the reason that I raised this question is that, to my, at least in my opinion, it is all about control. And the way you also mentioned Patrick Krogan and his interesting work, and how, in a way, what we can discuss is what is somehow what's already been coded, and that's now what Mark also added. It's which takes us also to the cybernetics. To my eyes, doesn't anyway allow a lot of room to discuss about play, and I don't want, to be honest, I just feel that our fundamentals in the studies that somehow always play comes back, and this is where resistance is found, nowadays is kind of being lost. And if we want to look for counter strategies, or if we want to somehow discuss how we oppose the quantification or the negative aspects that we see in the quantification and the self-quantification, then perhaps we should look elsewhere and see if, I don't know, we can find other, if you know, to tell us perhaps modes of self-quantification that are open, that the data is not centralized, that the data is not captured and aggregated in ways that we don't know how this is being happening. Because what you were saying about the black box was also very interesting, and how play facilitates that, for instance. I don't know if such examples come to your mind, for instance.
I think we can start playing with corporations, and we don't even have to have the technological ability to open the black boxes of our Fitbit. We just need to strap it onto our dog for a few weeks and then see what happens, right? We need to take a scattershot approach to our personal data and our quantification, and then we can use it in ways that benefit us for self-transformation, but then our sort of data profile that's being created can be muddied and messed up. You know, using the FitnessPal, we can experiment with only inputting purple foods for 1 week, which will totally ruin sort of the continuity of the data profile that's being created on us for sort of corporate advertising measures. We can exchange passwords to sort of our Fitbits or our Nike things on websites, and so we can log in and use each other's, you know, and that's amusing. It's funny, right? Like, I can't wait to see what my cat does on Fitbit. And that's a playful mode that doesn't require us to give up sort of some of the really fun and amusing and transformative potentials of quantified self and gamification measures.
We can mix up the order if you want to go first, Paul.
No.
Okay. You know, thank you for the question, Daphne, and I agree with you completely. I think we have to look at this whole, you know, gut reaction, and I fell into that, you know, mode at the end of my talk, that, you know, play is per se a form of resistance. I don't think that's always true. And actually my talk was geared towards the fact that, you know, the people doing this, they aren't necessarily in control. You know, when you're playing, it's not about control per se. You know, it's about enrapturement. You get carried away with what you're doing because it's fun, because it's pleasurable. And actually, you know, a lot of what's being done is actually quite bizarre, you know, and that's what I find interesting as a researcher. Is it per se subversive? No, of course not. But I do think that there are playful modes of engagement that can be so. And I think Jennifer just gave us quite a few good examples, and there's a lot of fun stuff you can do with these technologies. You think in terms of circuit bending, if you have the technological finesse, you can actually do some fun stuff. But going beyond that, in general, I'm an anthropologist, and what's fascinating is to see over and over again, this is true for all technology, people come up with their own uses for technologies. There's this idea that companies have when they put out products and services, and then there's what people actually do with them. And if you look at what self-quantifiers are doing, it's actually quite creative, quite inventive, and in many cases they are aggregating their data. There are sites up there like the Locker Project, which is in development, which lets people aggregate their own data, have control over their own data, and at least not be centralized in some company's storage system. There are these open source hardware projects out there. So there is that culture going on, and what was for me was very interesting to find out was that's where this stuff was coming from. This is a classic story of a subculture emerging as this bottom-up phenomenon, and then having the culture industry and the companies come along and try and incorporate it. But it's still there. It's a very young phenomenon too.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I would say if we want to try forms of resistance, we need to acknowledge that resistance and opposition are not good per se. So there needs to be somehow a way of questioning our own actions when we try to oppose or resist in any way, gamification, the QS movement, etc. Starting from questioning why we are doing it, if it makes any sense of doing it, etc. If you look at the PlayStation hacking case that started now more than 5 years ago, it basically started as a dispute about who owns PlayStation 3. Sony changed some of the features of the console, and some of the gamers decided to hack PlayStation Network. This has been mostly narrated on newspapers as a form of opposition against Sony and a debate about who owns the console, who owns the technology that you buy. Of course, there have been actually many different voices, many different actions being kind of classified around this PlayStation hacking case, and not all very consistent with each other. But particularly the idea of resisting to the control of a corporation by claiming control and possession on a technology that you own is not necessarily a much more liberating approach. It's not necessarily an alternative way of looking at the relation between ourselves and the technologies that we use. So I think the question of what is exactly that we're trying to find out is quite crucial. And it might be that we don't necessarily need to oppose in any way gamification and quantified self. Maybe we shouldn't be looking for forms of oppositions about alternatives. Yeah.
Can I add one thing on that? Actually, the last part, I left out one paragraph just because I saw it was over time. But talking about Deleuze and control society, Deleuze actually elaborated on Foucault's concept of the technologies of the self, and he pointed out to the key moment in the creation of the self among the ancient Greeks, which I think is actually quite telling for us nowadays. He said they created the self, the subject, by folding power according to a self-imposed rule. That's basically his model, a self-imposed rule, setting up your own rules. And I had this slide up from a gamification site, saying, okay, now you're quantified. What are you going to do next? What are your goals? What does it mean to be a better person? No one, really can define that. There are different people who define that in different ways, but I have my own definition. My boss obviously has a different definition, and am I playing according to his rules, or am I playing according to a rule I give myself? And I think that is the key moment here where the power structures that we're living into are folded and become a space of interiority where I actually have a space to play with myself. The German word Spielraum translates in English as wiggle room, and I think that hits it quite well. But we're always in these networks of power. We're not getting out.
Thanks. I think we should open up the discussion to the audience because we also started a bit later. So there are 2 microphones on the left and on the right. Please walk to them if you want to join the discussion and address a question to us.
It's very intimidating.
Okay.
Any self-bonfires among us?
Patrick is, I think, going. Okay, we have a question from Patrick.
All right. I want to play. Okay, I'm here. Okay. I think that all the talks were fantastic. Thank you very much. And being myself a subversive for over 25 years, this is the thing that I'm interested in, is the idea of subversive as a form of transgressive play. Yes, it's fun to, put your Fitbit on your cat, and actually the thing that I do is that I actually take my Nike Plus, and my partner and I drive around in our car and shake it, and I look like a marathon runner on Map My Run, and which is sort of fun. But and the other thing is that I won't talk about who is talking about this, but actually using big data plotting of Map My Run to see whether a assassination plot could be created by taking the quantified data and seeing where someone is at an average time during a week, and actually putting up cameras and capturing them, which I think is a dark side of this. But what I think what my question is that I think about Steve Kurtz and electronic civil disobedience as a form of resistance, and I love Paulo's work and Iokoze's work, and I think what I have a bit of a difference with here is this idea that Daphne is bringing up of control, and I'm wondering whether subversion can be more than fun, as that could be something that is a disruptive influence upon the neoliberal corporate agendas that a lot of this quantification is imposing upon us, and possibly cause some of the areas to falter. In other words, looking at playing with corporations as a form of resistance, as Jennifer was talking about. So I'm wondering what the, in my long-winded way, sorry, what the panel would think about that.
Okay. I can
Did I do that again?
No, it's good. No, we're thinking about it. It was great, actually. No, we're thinking, and actually, wanting to see who wants to go first, but I can try for this. That's obviously something a lot of people are interested in at this conference. Okay, yeah, subversion can be fun and whatnot, but how can we disrupt this system that is quite ominous and causes a lot of unease? I want to take a step back, though. I want to ask a counter question. Something that I've been thinking about. So why is this coming up now, right? Why this conjecture of play and games in the neoliberal economy, right? I mean, what is this actually telling us? And for me, it's a symptom that advanced capitalism is sort of getting a bit nervous. They're running out of places to invest their money profitably, running out of places to squeeze profitability out. They're running out of, their legitimization is falling apart. This dream that for most of the 20th century everyone could believe in, that we were all going to, be risen by the tide of profits being made and all some days live like Americans. Nowadays, no one wants to live like an American anymore, because America's in pretty sad shape, I'm sorry to say. But somehow, for me, these are all symptoms that the system is really in on shaky ground, and so they're trying to convince us, hey, it's all play. We're all having a great time, and this is a utopia that the Situationists called for in the middle of the 20th century. Read Marx's text and him talking about his ideal society. It sounds a lot like playing, and so they're trying to sell us this, and everyone who looks at it objectively, and all this quantification, gamification of work is really, really quite ominous and dystopian if that actually ever came to pass. And for me, it's a last-ditch attempt to save a failing system. And I don't know, talking about disruption, I personally think one of the most disruptive, subversive acts one can do is to take the utopian promise seriously. To actually ask myself, how do I lead a better life? What is a better life for me? What is a qualitatively better life for me? And I will come to a very different answer than, my employer, and that will lead to some very interesting questions. But to sort of take this utopian promise that is being, dangled in front of our noses like a carrot, this promise of a life full of play, and actually try and live it. And that would look quite different than this idea of gamification. That's my answer.
I don't know how I'd answer that. I think I would say that context matters. And my ability to be subversive and to remake and reform the spaces of possibility is rooted in sort of my privilege of being an educated, relatively well-off, perhaps technologically, maybe savvy person. And that's not the experience of most people. It's the experience of most of the people at this conference, but I perhaps have the ability to remake sort of my relationship with Fitbit, but most other people using it cannot. And so then I think that the responsibility comes on us as sort of makers or coders or artists to help show, wider uses and reappropriations of this sort of technology and make it more playful. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not an easy question, actually. I'll try to answer mostly as a member of Yokoso, of my group. I think in our practice, what we try to do is not really proposing a form of subversion to the quantified self-movement or gamification. I think in particular about this specific work, but not because we don't think it's necessary, of course. It is necessary to create forms of subversion. But in a sense, we try to ask ourselves what is that comes like slightly after acknowledging that, yes, of course, we are under control to a certain extent. There are things that we have that are used to track our movement. Most of these things are playful. It's how we accept them. Yeah, sure. So is the answer trying to find other ways of using these tools and technologies in an oppositional way? Yeah, maybe, possibly. But then the question that we try to ask ourselves is mostly, what else can we say? What else can we do apart from finding other uses, other forms of appropriation? Can we imagine other models, other, as we say in this project, other forms of life? In particular, in times of peace, it's a project that is, I believe it's an incredibly sad project, actually. It's a project where we let drones play with themselves, trying to imagine what a drone will do if it didn't need to be used by any human for war or for delivering pizza or whatever. And the project is about the impossibility of the drone of imagining anything really satisfying. And in a sense, I don't know, maybe it's also our difficulty, the difficulty of imagining a form of life that is somehow satisfying or acceptable after, having accepted the fact that there are technologies for monitoring and tracking our own lives. So it's not a form of opposition. It doesn't try to be that. It tries to ask different questions. It doesn't provide answers, really. Yeah. Okay.
Someone else? Something you would like to comment on or ask? Yeah.
Hello. Thank you very much for a really interesting panel. And I just have a, reference, maybe not a question. Like, Jennifer referred to how she would like to track or measure her cat, and to gather data and to make some, things of that. And I thought about Oriental philosophy, yoga, and various other things. they didn't have the technologies we have now, but they made like some kind of solutions how to live life well, how to feel good, how to, I don't know, they gather data from natural way. And what do you think like about that? Just we change the way we are gathering data, and we're searching for some solutions, but 1,000 years ago the solutions was like also found out. And is there like some ultimate truth of what we are seeking, what we're like living for, and just how we're using data, what for we are using data, and how it's like, I don't know, is it okay?
We hope that data can bring us happiness, but we're not quite sure what happiness itself is, right? Mm-hmm. And the problem is when we don't know, we like to rely on technology to provide certainty in sort of uncertain times, to give us sort of a direction forward, to help us solve our sort of analysis paralysis, because we're not sure what to do with our lives or where to seek happiness. And so we're using tech to sort of reduce risk, right, uncertainty. And the problem becomes when we're relying on these tools and the idea of measuring as a way to point forward, because at least it's incremental improvement, so I must be doing something right, is that it only measures things that can be easily measured, right? Binary. This is the same question that comes when you think of video games. Well, why do video games always, why are they so often premised around killing? Well, it's really easy to shoot and measure, okay, the enemy is dead, not dead, right? It's a yes or no answer. And so our complexity of our lives is distilled into these binary questions. And for me, that becomes sort of problematic when we turn to the digital to point our ways forward and to find happiness for us. Yeah.
Actually, I think this is a very valid answer. And you asked, is there any, one answer to this question? And I think no, there's no one truth to happiness, the goal of us being here, and how we should use this data. And I think that the way that people use these technologies are very, very different. They're multi-use technologies, and Daphne was talking in the beginning, and I think it's true that this can be a very stressful undertaking, and it can really heighten the stress in our daily lives. And I think for many people that's true. And if you're already an obsessive-compulsive person, if you start using this tracking technology, you can get very obsessed about these numbers. And at the same time, you also see people using them trying to quantify the state of flow. You read about people, they say they can use heart variation measurements to sort of help them attain, peak states, meditative states, flow, what Csikszentmihalyi calls one of the greatest states of happiness we can achieve. And so I think the way you're geared, the way you approach this technology really influences what comes out at the back end, right? And the technology itself, it's neutral, it's multi-use, and so it's actually, it's very interesting to see what people would do with these things. And to stop the more, dystopian things from happening. I mean, Lord knows. I mean, if one really looks at life as a game and you have a boss who's quantifying everything you do, every conversation you have, every keystroke you make, you have lost. So we have to stop that. I don't want that to be in that situation, and I don't want anyone else to be either. Yeah.
Thanks. Well, what can I say? I mean, I tried yoga too, but that also didn't work. So. In there. Now, yeah, I think, might be a kind of way of summarizing actually this panel, the question, what is a good life? So, in a sense, that's what sort of questions, what forms of evaluation can we invent to evaluate life and define, therefore, life and what it is? That's, I think, it's the question, in a sense.
And actually, that's the term of life form, is, ethos. Yeah. It translates roughly as life form. And this whole question, what's a good life? This is the traditional ethical question. And yeah, I think it's a valid point. Thousands of years ago, people had answers to these questions without these technologies. I don't know if the technologies really help us answer this question. I would say probably not.
I know people who are happy using the Nike Fuel wristband, so maybe it works for them.
I'm afraid that we have to close the discussion here because we already took a bit more time than we should. So thank you all.
Only one
you have to be.
short question.
But there was a lady before you, though. So it has to be very fast, and then I'm afraid we have to close and we can continue outdoors.
Thank you for the quick opportunity. So when we look at user behaviour with Fitbits and fitness trackers, we find about 40% of users stop using them in 6 months. And we might suggest that all of the gamification is applied to these technologies exactly because of this problem of holding on to your users, that people want to stop using them. So you've got to do all the psychological stuff to try and keep them at all. When we look at these quantified self-technologies in that way, how does that shift how we understand them about power, control and surveillance?
I'd like to ask one of you to respond, as time is very tight.
Yeah, actually, it's a wonderful point because it just shows that one really has to look at the usage, and you know, all the dystopian scenarios dissipate very quickly when we see people opt in and then they opt out. And actually, Jennifer, you in one of your texts, you had a wonderful example of a little boy who was using, I don't know, Fitbit or some tracker, you know, with his dad, and they were playing games, competitive games with some office buddy, and at some point, you know, they got bored with it and they started making their own rules, you know, and so by adding new rule layers, which, you know, companies can do, but you can do yourself, in metagaming, you can keep these things interesting because, yeah, we're into novelty and things wear off, and then we put them aside and try something new. That's true.
Okay. Thanks a lot. Thank you all for being here, especially Mr. Barnes.